I feel like these are the type of questions I'm always terrible at answering when you ask about feeling. Like, how did you feel? Yeah, I feel like I get this at work sometimes. It's like, how do these things make you feel?
Just like, I don't feel.
I feel nothing.
I feel nothing. No, I mean, I was left with an impression of kind of like, I was shocked, like that it ended the way that it did.
It's a shocking ending.
Yeah, I was like, what the fuck, but at the same time, I think it's difficult for me to like comfortably be like, yeah, I think it was a good way to end the movie. I think it was really clever and I liked how it ended. But I think that anybody who didn't think that entire like dojo should kind of just be like burned to the ground and like all of it should have been disbanded because of like both all the crooked accounting dealings that were happening, the extortion, the blackmail.
Which so you find out because Jessie, I don't know if we mentioned this, but Casey is an accountant.
Right.
And so whenever he gets hired to the books, he figures out that the sensei is just basically fucking blackmailing everybody.
All those videos, like the video that he found of his own beating, like all those videos that had been made were being used to blackmail old students into continuing to pay dues.
Yeah. And essentially those videos are called, what is it? Faces of Fists?
Faces of Fists. So he's made a whole compilation of like videos where they ended up beating people to death, and he's like selling a whole video series called Faces of Fists, which I guess is a call out to Faces of Death.
Yeah,
right?
Old school shit.
Some old school like videos that you could rent, from the video store, wherever that was for you. And like, yeah, it's just interesting. He's got like this whole racket basically around blackmailing people, and like he's got the students to do his dirty work. So like all of that being there, and like the hierarchy of like violence and dominance and misogyny and just like the entire ideology of the dojo, like really at the end of the day, all he does is he like puts a picture of his fucking dead dachshund on the wall like he's fucking John Wick or some shit. And like,
what up, John Wick?
yeah, shouts to John Wick. What's up?
Baba Yaga. It was just a fucking car, just a fucking dog. Just a dog.
No, but like, hey, call me when we're going to hang out.
We'll go to the range, John Wick. Hit us up.
Come on the show, man. Come on. You're welcome anytime.
Come on, Red Library, John Wick.
Come on, Red Library. But like, he basically like preserves the entire order instead and just like subjects himself to the same order once again, because now he's put arguably the most brutal of all of the students in charge. So it's kind of like the thing that I wonder about at the end of the movie is like, will Anna's character, Imogen Poots' character, be more or less brutally like violent and like, you know?
Because she does say like whenever she gets the black belt from Casey and sort of takes the place of the sensei, she basically says the ideology you've been taught so far is that like compassion is weakness, but there's another way. And yet at the same time, you have no indication that she is not going to be just like equally as fucking brutal as like everything else.
In fact, she says it, right? She says like it is even more violent to like work with restraint and compassion so that you can achieve the most from your actions. Doesn't she say something like that? That like she argues that like just the violence of...
I feel like that's a Zizek point.
Yeah, I was going to say,
maybe, but like I feel like her little speech at the end, she kind of tries to contextualize and say like, well, before it was always just aggression and violence and dominance, but now I'm going to teach you restraint in order that you can be an even better fighter, because that like those capacities are just as important in your combat.
But in some way, what she sort of offers as like this change in ideology is sort of just the other side of the rigid gender binary distinction of like, okay, a male has been running the studio and so everything is just like hyper masculine violence and repression. What I'm going to offer you is instead the incorporation of some like compassion and these almost like feminine kind of traits in this like rigid binary way. I'm going to offer you those things without deconstructing the hierarchy or the general sort of functioning of the dojo. That was kind of my read of it.
My only response to some of it would be that she was the person who specifically like tried to prevent Casey's character from getting killed. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there is some evidence that I think she was pretty uncomfortable with that aspect of the functioning of the dojo. So I feel like the very fact that she remained as long as she did in the dojo means that she obviously probably has some aspects that are still pretty negative. But I think that, I don't know, like I don't think it's a stretch to say that I think as the audience we are supposed to understand that she maybe doesn't have those worst tendencies that the sensei did.
I mean, maybe we can kind of start moving into like general points of analysis that we thought was interesting. But I was wondering for y'all, do you read the ending as in some way, I don't know if it's self-consciously critical of this or not, but it's almost as if the message is the hierarchy, the structure, all these things aren't the problem. It's essentially just whether there's a certain kind of like person or quality, or like, let's say, like, we're going to talk about this a lot, quote unquote, toxic masculinity in the place of leadership and in dominance. But if that's not in dominance, like these other like structures in the hierarchy isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I think that's why I definitely wanted to talk about hierarchies, because I think it comes to this point of like, if her taking the lead at the head of the hierarchy, is there still a problem with it in general? And I think we maybe had even discussed talking about hierarchies as like a whole, and our approaches to those.
Yeah.
So let's dive into this point because I think this is one of the first things we talked about at the end of watching it was, what is y'all's take on the sort of depiction of hierarchy and how that functions in the film?
Okay, so I think that it's like an extremely it's like a central theme that you, by agreeing to like participate in the class, you've basically like subjected yourself to sensei and like his rules, and then you like honor all these rules, like literally explicit rules that are like on the wall, and sort of take very seriously all of the principles that he's teaching, you know, incorporate them into your life outside of the dojo. And like that bleeding into your life outside of the dojo is kind of that interesting thing I was trying to mention earlier, that sort of duality that you see when sensei does that like description of his like lame night where he's gonna like watch a movie by himself, but he's like simultaneously like fucking like kicking someone's ass and tearing their heart out, like with his like, you know, his charade little like whatever his movements that he does. It's interesting how, you know, on the surface it seems like, oh, this is innocent enough, somebody's just attending karate classes, to like, you know, and Casey lies about it the whole time. He tries to tell the sensei that he didn't get attacked, you know, but like he's like, I don't know, it's like some stupid questionnaire that the sensei is asking him to fill out about like why he wants to like do karate, and it's like, was it because you know want some exercise? Was it because you were like beat up? You know,
so like traumatic experience, self-defense is like one of the things, and like so he reads through this list of like multiple choice things, and then Casey is like, oh, well, like, I don't think it's any of those. Or he says something that's not one of the list, and Sensei just looks at him and he says, I'll read the options again.
But at that point, you don't know that it was Sensei that like beat him up in the first place, right? So it's just kind of funny that he's like taking a survey of the students that come in, and that's one of the choices, like that you had a traumatic event and you need like self-defense because you were like attacked.
But I think ideologically, and whenever we're going to talk about basically whether the dojo is like a perfect laboratory for like fascism, but that's like what's really interesting to me, because that moment is really funny to be like, well, you don't fit into any of these categories. But basically it's like Casey tries to say no, like it's something that's outside of those categories, and Sensei like doesn't even register it properly.
No,
he basically just says, oh, I'll just read them again.
Like, should I read the answer choices again?
Yeah, it's like you have to fit into one of these categories.
And I think that's a good point about gender as well. It like overlaps pretty interestingly, because that's another point that I'd like to make maybe later about the back and forth between like feminine and masculine that you see throughout the movie. But I guess like my thing, more so than hierarchy, I guess for me, there's like a structure of abuse that this movie discusses, and like that basically, because, you know, Eisenberg's character, Casey, internalizes the idea of the power that was, you know, held by the people that attacked him and like sort of brutalized him. Because he like internalizes that as being the fluidity and the like ability to enact power, then he begins to adopt this certain structure in his life that promises to put him in the position of being able to enact that power himself and that brutality himself. Yeah,
which he does tell the sensei at some point he wanted to become the thing that intimidated him.
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of the theme throughout the movie, and I, you know, obviously from my like Lacanian perspective, right, like it's absolutely it's a thing that happens to most people, right, when they are victims of trauma or abuse, but it's specifically to not accept that the power structure that dominated you is the one that you must now incorporate yourself into, that will allow you to move past traumas that you experience, right? Or like work through them. At the end of the day, it is the restraint and the ability not to become brutal and like fully incorporate like this misogynistic, fascistic ideology into your life and be okay with just having karate classes as like a way of exercise and self-defense that would let you have your life back or let you feel more empowered, falling fully into the fucking practice of like going on the motorcycle chases and like doing all the horrible things like killing people and cremating bodies and shit. That's the thing that like actually really disrupts your entire life and makes you a monster.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, as someone who does therapy with survivors of trauma and violence, and, you know, as someone who's been through that myself, like, yeah, that is absolutely what you adopt. It's like you develop what is called in like attachment theory, what's called an internal working model. And basically your internal working model, whether you realize it or not, of like how to have power and agency in your life and control over your life, the only thing you incorporate is that, well, like basically brutalizing and dominating other people. This is what it's like to have power. Yeah. And so that becomes, in an unconscious way, the exact way you seek out power. And it doesn't matter if you feel brutalized and you're the victim, like that's still your working model of what power is. And it's a really fucking insidious thing to like take on.
Yeah. And so I
real shit on the Patreon only episodes, fuckers.
Real shit. But that's, yeah, when you ask me what my impressions were of that movie, I think that is like the central thing that is being discussed throughout the entire movie. And at the end of it, they fall short of really being able to provide a solution or like some kind of scenario where I believe that Jessie would be able to move forward from that.
Well, that's a good point, because that's what I was left with is my thing, you know, not so much like emotionally.
Keep calling him Jesse. I meant Casey.
Well,
you know
fuck
what
it. I don't care. He doesn't care. He's not here to defend himself.
Apparently, he's like really like, he's like very like, nobody touch me. Like,
yeah.
I don't talk to fans and shit kind of thing. But anyway, whatever.
I mean, that was what I was left with at the end, was this question of, is this actually a failure of an ability to offer any way to any liberatory perspective out of this sort of deadlock of hierarchy and what it does to you to be like sort of incorporated into it? And I didn't really know if the film was trying to show that, like the failure of that, as a very consciously critical reflection of, to say, even if you put the opposite of these qualities in the place of the master over all of this, it still preserves everything that made this possible. Or if it was almost, like a sort of unconscious failure of a way to offer any kind of way for like Casey to be liberated out of this.
I'd at least like to talk about maybe two different possibilities for when you're talking about this hierarchy. Mm-hmm. I guess it's the question of, is this type of hierarchy like a martial arts style teaching method? Is that in and of itself inherently like negative, or is it just this aspect specifically that is? And I feel like that would, at least to me, when we're talking about these like this approach to hierarchies and whether we should be critical of them or not, is, I feel like it's maybe something we should talk about, because I feel like if we're talking specifically about this one, like I do find it very hard to believe that after many years and all the other members being basically indoctrinated into this like very misogynistic and very like almost like fascistic type of karate practice of them, even if a new sensei, like even if she tries to fix it, that it's going to be very easily fixed, and it's just better just to like smash it into 1,000 pieces or something like that. I think it's maybe another question though is that style of hierarchy in general something that is inherently negative, or can there be something positive out of that?
Yeah, so maybe could there be like a hierarchy of skill or experience that is actually one that isn't inherently violent and brutal and fascistic in a way? I mean, it's an interesting question, because if we look at it this way, I think we would have to then analyze the whole depiction of the dojo in the film as saying hierarchy plus horrible misogyny is the thing that leads to this sort of violence, or particular sort of need for security. And I want to read through Umberto Eco's 14 distinguishing characteristics of fascism here to like lay this out.
I think every single one of those is exhibited.
I think almost every single one of them is spot on. But I think it's an interesting question, because one of the things that I wonder about, especially thinking about anarchist perspectives and like anarcho-communist perspectives, is that hierarchy in itself is the problem. And I do wonder, using my good old Melanie Klein object relations framework, is this inherently what we would call a paranoid schizoid position? What we talked about with Comrade Neil is like where we can only see things as good or bad without any nuance or any ability to see that there are certain contexts that things can exist in, that it's the context and like the certain material unique traits of them and how they develop that make them what they are. But you can't necessarily say something inherently is one thing or the other. I mean, you can maybe with some things. I mean, we could probably talk about fascism itself as being inherently a fucking shitty thing, but